Hey everyone, how's it going? Welcome back to Techniques of the Week. If I rush a little bit through this one, I'm sorry. It turns out I just did this and it didn't record anything that I said. So I'm a little bit frustrated, but we're just going to jump right back into it. What we're talking about today is negative thinking errors, and this is for a more advanced Monday. So today we'll talk about negative thinking errors. We'll do check-ins. There are tons of thinking errors. I tried to reduce it to just 8 that I think are more common. Then we'll do a challenge and best ways to get in touch with me. So some good news, I played golf yesterday, and I know some of you remember that I had foot surgery back in October and November. And this was my first time back out walking the course, and my feet held up great. Media review, we got 2 new albums over the weekend. We got Fleetwood Mac's Rumors and Lady Antebellum's Ocean. And so while we were cleaning the house on Saturday, we got to rock out. It was kind of fun. And a random fact related to today's lesson is that the pressure to feel happy can have the opposite effect. And I've talked about this in some previous screencasts, the thought flow and mindfulness screencast, and then also the emotional I feel statements. It's okay to feel down or sad, but oftentimes we put this pressure on ourselves to feel happy. And when we do that, we often have the opposite effect. So it's better to identify and say, yep, I'm feeling a little bit low, and that's okay. And recognize that as an automatic thought that you can just sort of let drift through you rather than really dwelling on it and saying, I should be happy all the time. So the first two we'll talk about are personalization and the shoulds. So personalization is where you compare everything to yourself. And this is what happens when we spend a lot of time on social media. We make these upward social comparisons where we compare other people's life or what they have or where they are or what kind of car they drive. We compare that to us. And that usually doesn't end up well for us. So, for example, everyone else gets finished with their chores way before I do, and their work looks a lot better than mine. I'm just kind of useless. If you find yourself doing this or personalization or comparing to others a lot, the best way to limit it is to focus on your strengths. We all have areas that we really excel, so focus on what you are able to do well rather than maybe what somebody else does better than you. And the shoulds, this is a very rigid type of thinking where everything is governed by a rule and there can be no deviation. So letter of the law, it has to be this way, that's the rule. For example, I should be able to go to school and get all my work done. I should be able to go to work and get a raise. I should be able to go home and cook a good meal without any conflicts. All of these shoulds just sort of add up. And I mean, the real world isn't that way. You might want that, but when you put that should on you, that's a lot of pressure, and you don't need that on yourself. So if you find you're falling prey to a very rigid or rule-bound pattern of thinking, the best thing you can do is try to find exceptions. I like to say, there's 3 exceptions to every rule. See if you can find 1 or 2 of them. Or if it's a rule that's not, really actually against the law, if it's more of a guideline, like in Pirates, find some way to bend that rule and show yourself that not everything needs to be this rigid. Magnification is where you make something a really big deal. Now, where this becomes a negative thinking error is if you're focusing on just the negative aspects of a single thing. So you make a small hiccup into a huge burden. For example, if you're having a tough time with a math problem, that means you're never going to graduate. That means you're never going to really learn how to budget or find a job or be successful at anything. It's really a way that we let these thoughts control the volume in our head. They take over and they turn it up to 10, and it just gets really, really difficult. So if you find yourself magnifying some of the negatives, just remember that you're the one that's in control. I know people don't really have dials on their stereos anymore, but just think about turning that volume down, and you're the one that's in control. You're the one that gives that volume to whatever you're magnifying, so just try to turn it down. Filtering is also known as tunnel vision, where we only look at one element of a situation and ignore everything else. So we pick out one little thing without seeing the whole big picture. So let's say you get a 95% on your tracker. But that constructive feedback for the 5%, you let that ruin the rest of your day because you didn't get a perfect score. You're only focusing on the 5% you didn't do well. So maybe you were a couple minutes late or you forgot your pencil. I mean, 95 is great, but if all you're doing is focusing on how you need to improve that 5%, that's going to ruin the rest of your day. If you find yourself filtering a lot, the good news is you've already figured out that you know how to filter. Your brain is good at filtering. So now we just need to train ourselves to, instead of filtering in the negatives, we want to filter in the positives. So we're really looking at those positives and looking on the bright side instead of dwelling on the negatives. For overgeneralization, that is where one mistake that makes you think that the whole world is ruined. It's all wrong. It's never going to be right again. An example of this is you've got a romantic interest and you ask him or her, they on a date, and they say no. And then you take that to mean that you're never going to find love. You're going to end up all alone, withered, with no family and no friends, and no one's ever going to care. Right? That's not the way it's going to play out, but it's easy to fall prey to that thinking error. So if you are overgeneralizing a lot, the best thing you can do is check the evidence. Where is the evidence? Where is the actual data that tells me that this is what's going to happen? We make all these forecasts. We think we know what's going to happen, but we really don't in most cases. So really checking the evidence for what we actually know can help mitigate this. And mind reading. We all think we have psychic powers from time to time. Mind reading is essentially assuming that we know how someone else is feeling or what they're thinking and why. For example, your boss gives you some constructive redirection and you presume it's because she thinks that you're terrible at your job, right? So my boss, my supervisor, could come to me and say, Joe, I need you to fill out this Medicaid log. If I'm mind reading in a negative way, I might say, oh, she thinks I'm terrible at my job. She thinks I'm a terrible school psych. She didn't really want to hire me. She was pressured into doing it because there's not enough of us. And you can go down that route. The best thing you can do to limit mind reading is to generate an alternative. Another common example here is if you get cut off on the highway. It's easy to think, oh, they cut me off because they're jerks, they're mean, they thought I was going too slow, or they weren't even paying attention to me. And an alternative might be, well, they must really have to get somewhere. Maybe there's an emergency, maybe their kid's in the hospital, maybe if they don't make it there on time, they're going to lose their job. You can generate a positive alternative that doesn't have anything to do with you, and that can sometimes help when we get too into reading other people's minds. Polarized thinking and catastrophizing, I think, are two of the more common thinking errors that you guys are probably familiar with. Polarized thinking is that black and white thinking where it's all or nothing, there's no areas of gray, there's no in between, and it's all do or die. For example, you're 5 minutes late getting up or getting out the door, and so you end up not going anyway because the entire day's ruined, right? You lost your perfect track record. So why even try? The day is ruined. The best way to limit black and white thinking is to try to think in percentages. Very, very rarely is anything ever black and white. Is anything ever 0% or 100%, right? There's almost always going to be some wiggle room or some shades of gray, and just try to focus on thinking in those percentages or in those different shades of gray. Catastrophizing is where we think that the world is ending. So we have a small event that indicates something terrible is about to ruin your life or the entire world. For example, you wake up with a headache and it hasn't gone away by 11, so you start thinking that obviously you must have brain cancer or something else terrible is going to happen. We all have done this before, so don't feel bad if you have. But the best way to limit this is to research the odds and not spend so much time thinking about that worst case scenario, but think about how often does that actually occur and what does that mean in terms of how often does the opposite occur or something totally benign occur. So my challenge for you guys today is to identify a negative thinking style in yourself. We all do these. We all have these habits. And the only way that we can change some of our habits is to be aware of them in the first place. So just see if any of these sort of sound like, oh, yeah, I do that a little bit, or yeah, I tend to have that thinking style. So maybe I need to look into how I can address it. If you're not quite ready to dive into your own thinking style. Sometimes that's pretty hard and asking a lot. You can always find these in sitcoms or your favorite TV shows or movies. They often include characters with these thinking errors because it tends to grab the audience and say, oh, you're doing it wrong, that's a weird way to think about something. They tend to be a little bit more entertaining. So you can do it in a character that you know or that you don't really like, or just your favorite movie. One area of caution, though, I would avoid any temptation to identify these in your close friends or family. When you do that unsolicited, that tends to bring out some conflict and some drama. So if somebody's asking for help, or if you're trying to be supportive and they're looking for guidance, maybe. But if you just sort of start telling people how their thinking errors are maladaptive, tends to start a fight that you didn't need to. And then the last slide, I got a new address down at the bottom. This week I will be living on Sesame Street. So hope to hear from you guys. Take care.